For years, the tech world has repeated the same storyline again and again. Linux is finally catching up. Linux is improving fast. Linux is becoming usable for normal people. But what if that story is completely backward? What if Linux didn't suddenly become better, more polished, or more user-friendly in some dramatic way? What if the real story is that Windows slowly fell behind, step by step, decision by decision, until the gap closed not because Linux ran faster, but because Windows stopped moving forward in the ways that actually mattered to users? To understand this, we have to go back to a time when Windows genuinely deserved its dominance. In the late 90s and early 2000s, Windows was not just popular, it was powerful, flexible, and surprisingly open for its era. Windows XP, for all its flaws, gave users a sense of ownership over their machines. You installed the operating system, and it belonged to you. You decided what ran on startup. You chose how your desktop looked. You installed software from wherever you wanted, without pop-ups warning you that you were about to do something dangerous. The system stayed out of your way most of the time. When something broke, it felt like a technical problem, not a philosophical disagreement between you and the operating system vendor. Linux existed back then too, but it was rough. It demanded knowledge, patience, and curiosity. Hardware support was inconsistent. Configuration often meant editing text files and reading documentation written by developers for other developers. The gap between Windows and Linux was obvious and massive. Windows was where work got done. Linux was where enthusiasts experimented. Fast forward to today, and something strange has happened. Linux is still Linux. It still uses the same kernel philosophy. It still relies on package managers, permissions, modular components, and a culture that values transparency and user control. Yes, desktops have improved. Yes, installers are friendlier. Yes, hardware support is better. But at its core, Linux didn't undergo a miraculous transformation. Its values stayed consistent. What changed dramatically was Windows. Microsoft began shifting Windows away from being a tool you own, toward being a service you merely access. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, subtle, and often justified with language about security, convenience, and modernization. Automatic updates sounded like a good idea. Telemetry was framed as a way to improve quality. Online accounts were marketed as a way to sync settings and enhance productivity. Each individual change felt small, even reasonable. But together, they altered the relationship between user and system. Windows updates used to be something you initiated. You chose when to install them. You could ignore them if you wanted. Today, updates feel mandatory, intrusive, and unpredictable. The system may restart when you didn't ask it to. It may change settings you deliberately configured. It may introduce new features you didn't request while removing or hiding ones you relied on. This isn't progress from the user's perspective. It's a loss of agency. Meanwhile, Linux continued doing what it always did. Updates are there when you want them. You decide when to apply them. You decide which components update and which do not. If something breaks, you can often see exactly why. Because logs are accessible, and the system doesn't actively obscure its own behavior. Linux didn't improve in this area. Windows regressed. Then there's performance. On modern hardware, Windows often feels heavier than it should. Fresh installations come with background services running immediately, many of them unrelated to what the user actually wants to do. Search indexing, telemetry collection, background syncing, preloading apps, scanning for updates, and promotional features all compete for system resources. On high-end machines, this is mostly hidden by brute force. On mid-range and low-end hardware, it's painfully obvious. Linux, on the other hand, often feels fast, not because it became radically more efficient, but because it never added that bloat in the first place. A lightweight Linux desktop today behaves much like a lightweight Linux desktop did 10 years ago. It starts quickly. It uses what it needs, and little more. When people say Linux is faster now, what they're often experiencing is the contrast between restraint and excess, not innovation versus stagnation. Privacy is another area where the illusion of Linux improvement masks a Windows decline. Linux has always been privacy-respecting by default. Not because of marketing, but because of its architecture and community values. Most Linux distributions do not collect personal data, unless explicitly configured to do so. There is no single corporate entity whose business model depends on telemetry or user profiling across the entire ecosystem. Windows, by contrast, increasingly treats user data as a resource. Even when data collection is anonymized or justified as diagnostic, the fact remains that it is collected by default. Controlled by policies that can change, and governed by an opaque system most users do not fully understand. Settings to disable telemetry are scattered, incomplete, or ignored in certain editions. Updates may re-enable features users deliberately turned off. Again, Linux didn't improve here. Windows fell behind the expectations of users who value privacy and control. Software installation tells a similar story. On Linux, installing software typically involves a package manager. You search, click install, and the system handles dependencies. This has been the norm in Linux for decades. It's boring, predictable, and efficient. Windows historically relied on downloadable installers, each with its own update mechanism, bundled offers, and system modifications. That wasn't ideal, but it was familiar. Instead of fully embracing a unified package management approach early, Windows hesitated. When the Microsoft Store finally arrived, it was incomplete, inconsistent, and often inferior to traditional installation methods. Some apps were available, others were not. Some versions lagged behind. Developers were slow to adopt it. Users didn't trust it. Meanwhile, Linux kept quietly doing what it had always done, and suddenly it looked modern by comparison. Customization is another revealing area. Windows used to be highly customizable. Over time, that freedom has narrowed. System themes are more locked down. Interface elements are harder to modify without third-party tools. Registry hacks are required for basic changes. Updates may break or undo customizations. The system increasingly tells you how it should look and behave, rather than asking how you want it to work. Linux desktops remain diverse. You can choose an environment that mimics classic Windows, Mac OS, or something entirely different. You can replace components at will. If you don't like how something works, there is often an alternative. This isn't because Linux suddenly embraced customization. It always had it. Windows simply moved away from it. Even stability, once a Windows strength, now feels less certain. Major Windows updates sometimes introduce bugs that affect printing, networking, gaming performance, or system stability. Emergency patches follow. Workarounds circulate. Users learn to delay updates, not because they dislike security, but because they fear disruption. Linux updates can also break things, but the difference is choice. You choose when to update. You can stick to long-term support releases. You can hold packages back. Control changes the emotional experience of stability. Gaming is often cited as the last great barrier where Linux truly improved. But even here, the story is more complex. Linux gaming advanced largely because Windows gaming became entangled with DRM systems, background services, launchers, and anti-cheat mechanisms that complicated the experience. Tools like Proton didn't just make Linux better. They exposed how fragile and overcomplicated Windows gaming stacks had become. Linux didn't replace Windows as the native gaming platform. It adapted to Windows complexity and worked around it. The corporate direction of Windows also matters. Decisions are made to satisfy enterprise customers, advertisers, and shareholders. Individual users are often secondary. Features are added to drive ecosystem lock-in, promote services, or collect metrics. When users complain, responses are slow or dismissive. Linux, for all its fragmentation, does not have a single authority pushing unwanted changes onto everyone at once. Power is distributed, sometimes chaotically, but rarely coercively. What we are witnessing is not a Linux renaissance driven by massive innovation, but a re-evaluation of priorities by users. As Windows accumulated friction, Linux remained familiar to those willing to try it. The learning curve didn't disappear. It just stopped getting steeper, while Windows did. The pain points shifted. When someone switches to Linux today and says, "This feels refreshing," what they often mean is, "This system isn't fighting me. It doesn't nag. It doesn't advertise. It doesn't assume it knows better. It doesn't hide itself behind layers of abstraction designed to protect corporate interests rather than user understanding." Linux didn't suddenly become perfect. It still has issues with certain hardware, niche software, and professional tools. It still demands learning. But the baseline expectations of users have changed. People now value control, predictability, privacy, and transparency more than flashy features and cloud integration. Windows moved away from those values. Linux stayed. In that sense, Linux didn't improve. It stayed consistent. Windows changed direction. And in doing so, it created the illusion that Linux caught up, when in reality, Windows stepped back. This shift is subtle, but profound. It explains why longtime Windows users feel increasingly uncomfortable, even if they can't articulate why. It explains why Linux feels less alien than it once did. The gap didn't close because Linux crossed it. The gap closed because Windows moved. And that is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the modern operating system debate. The rise of Linux on the desktop is not a triumph of rapid progress. It is a quiet indictment of a platform that forgot who it was built for.